All right, so it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Patricia Lockwood here for our Motivated Cognition meeting. Dr. Lockwood is a professor of decision neuroscience at the University of Birmingham, as well as a Sir Henry Dale and Jacobs Foundation research fellow. After receiving her bachelor's from the University of Bristol and her PhD at the University of College London, she now leads the Social Decision Neuroscience Lab at the University of Birmingham. Here, she uses behavioral paradigms, computational modeling, neuroimaging, and patient studies to study the cognitive, computational, and neural mechanisms of social learning and decision making. She's earned many awards specifically for her innovation and has several early career awards, including from the Association for Psychological Science, the Society for Social Neuroscience, British Association for Cognitive Neuroscience, and the Society for Economics. Today, she will be talking to us about computational approaches to prosocial behavior. When and how do we help each other help other people? So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lockwood.
So thank you so much for the invitation to join your meetings today, and for all of you attending. I'm really excited to tell you about some of the work that we've been doing, and thank you for the very nice introduction. So I slightly changed my talk title just because I wanted to integrate a new study. So hopefully that's okay, but the vibe will be the same. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about causal computational approaches to understanding social behavior. So why do I think that this is an important question to answer? Well, we know that from things such as climate change to infectious disease and aging populations, that current and future generations face these really great challenges. And the solution to these challenges has to be in part behavioral. It's going to rely us on making decisions that help others, but also these behaviors will be affected by what other people around us say and do. And at a basic level, we can really define these prosocial behaviors as simply an action that I take that has a benefit for another person. These prosocial behaviors are really important for our physical health and our mental health across the lifespan, and of course, as I said, for solving these global challenges. Another concept that I'll cover today is social influence. And we can also define social influence in a very simple way, as instead an action or a preference that someone else does can change our own preferences. But there's still much to understand about these different processes. For example, we know that prosocial behaviors are very effortful. How willing are we to make effortful actions? And we've started to understand some of the mechanisms of social influence, but we need to understand when and how it occurs. So to answer these questions, I've taken this multi-level modeling approach to understanding prosocial behavior and social influence. And these concepts have often been studied in social psychology, but I think this computational modeling approach can be really useful because the idea is that we can connect the different levels together rather than just looking at one level in isolation. So this framework is really inspired by the visual neuroscience framework of David Marr. And Marr argued that in order to understand an information processing system, we need to consider these multiple levels. So first, we need to understand the computation or the why or the goal that we're trying to achieve. So in this case, it would be prosocial behavior and social influence. The next thing that we need to understand is the algorithm or rules that we use to achieve the computation. And of course, there's going to be lots of different algorithms we use. These are probably quite, simplistic accounts of the sort of complicated computations that we have to perform behaviorally. But I think what's very useful is taking these models often from outside of social cognition, so things like effort discounting, associative learning, and temporal discounting, and look at them as mechanisms for understanding why we make different decisions, so what kind of the rules could be. And in all of these models, I guess the key thing that unifies them is we're trying to compute value. So we're trying to understand why people make certain choices based on the value of different options that they encounter. So the final level that we need to understand is the implementation or the how or the physical. And the idea here is that we might have specific parts of the brain that are very important for prosocial behavior and social influence. So what I'm showing here at the bottom is some parts of the brain that I'm going to focus on today. So those parts of the brain are the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, or areas 8 and 9. Also, this area 24 prime, which is in the anterior cingulate gyrus. And note that this gyral region is quite different from this area 32 just above it, which is often talking about in decision-making studies. And finally, we've got the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex, or area 25 here. And what I think is very interesting about these parts of the brain is perhaps at the implementational level, we can start to see dissociations between parts of the brain that do social processes like prosocial behavior and social influence, and parts of the brain that might be more domain general. So they might care both about social and about non-social processes. And today I'll also be talking about a particular approach that we can use to dissect those different parts of the brain, and that's this voxel-based lesion symptom mapping. So this approach, which has a very long name, what it does is it takes the parameters from the computational model, it takes a wider area of brain damage, and we can map specifically where in the brain is associated with that model parameter and try and dissociate the social from the non-social. So that's the approach that I'm going to try and use today. So I'm going to use it to ask 3 questions. So first of all, how willing are we to put an effort to help other people? And how are these algorithms implemented in the brain? Secondly, how do we actually learn to help others? How do we learn from the outcomes of our actions when they have helped or harmed? And how are those algorithms implemented in the brain? And finally, how are we influenced by the actions of other people? And can we identify specific algorithms there that are shown in the brain? So starting with the first question, if we look at previous research that's tried to measure prosocial behavior, quite often what has been used is economic games. So these have been very powerful for showing us certain aspects about how people make decisions. And what I'm showing in the picture here is an example of a dictator game. So you might be familiar with that, but just to recap, in a dictator game, you have 2 different people, a decider and a recipient. And the decider is given an amount of money. And they have a very simple decision to make. They can choose to keep all of the money for themselves. They can give some of it to this anonymous recipient participant, or they can give all of their money away. And what we often see is that people are, maybe about 35% of people will give some of the money away to the other person, but there's a lot of variability in this. These things might change over the lifespan. It's potentially a good assay of prosocial behavior, but I think it has 2 critical limitations. So first of all, if we do want to look at how things change across the lifespan or how things change in different contexts, then one problem is that if I give money away to the other person, I'm losing money myself. So we're not really getting an independent measure of how much I value money for me and how much I value money for another person. Differences could just be because how I value money myself changes in different contexts and across the lifespan. I think the second limitation is that economic games often overlook these effort costs. And what I mean by that is in everyday prosocial behaviors, often we're having to apply either cognitive or physical effort. You know, things like holding open door for strangers, helping out our colleagues with their work, kind of any prosocial action we engage in will have a certain effort cost to it too. But these kind of games don't typically manipulate effort. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to design an experiment that separated self and other value on independent trials, and so that the cost of helping someone else was not financial. And we also wanted to manipulate the amount of effort people had to put in order to be prosocial. So what we did in one of these studies, I'll talk about the imaging study today, is we tested 39 young adults, so they were aged 18 to 36. And before we did the experiment, we used this social deception procedure that is kind of common to a lot of the studies that I'll talk about today. So I'll just walk through it. So what happened was there were 2 people either side of a door, so this self and other circle here, this is like an aerial view, and they wore this kind of weird marigold, so this yellow rubber glove. And they did that so that would just hide any information about their age, their gender, their kind of appearance or attractiveness. And they just wave either side of the door to one another, and they'd also be with 2 experimenters. And what this did was it showed the participant who had come in there really was another person there who would receive the rewards collected for them, but they couldn't see any of those characteristics that might change their motivation to help. After we did that procedure, we got people to squeeze this physical effort grip force device as hard as they could, and this measured their maximum voluntary contraction, so their physical strength. So then we could use that as a baseline to present them effort offers that were proportionate to them. And we did this particular study while people were scanned with fMRI. So we gave them a task where on each trial they received a cue that showed them whether it was for them themselves or whether the trial was going to have an outcome for the other person. And on the offer that they saw, it always varied in these kind of two different options. So the rest offer was always 1 credit, so a really small amount of money converted into payment at the end, but people didn't have to put in any effort. Or they could pick the work offer, and the work offer they could always get more credits, so they could get 2 to 10 credits, but they'd also have to squeeze this grip force device more, so between 30 to 70% of their maximum. And on the self trials, they chose between the options. They then actually had to energize the action, so they got real-time feedback as to whether they energized it over this yellow line that changed depending on the effort level. And then they got the credit, so they could earn this extra money for them, which was converted into real money. But crucially, on these prosocial or other trials, they made the choice, they exerted the effort, but this other person that they met in this procedure at the beginning got the credits. We modulated this over multiple trials. So what this task allowed us to do was to ask these two questions. So first of all, are people equally willing to choose to put in effort to reward themselves and the other person? And secondly, can we find these specific parts of the brain that seem to code this representation of prosocial and not self-benefiting effort? And what we saw was that people seem to be less willing to put in effort to help other people than oneself. So I think that might seem like quite an obvious conclusion, but what I think is really interesting is it was modulated by the effort cost. So it was this interaction between recipients and effort. And what we see here is that as the effort level increases, people are just less and less likely to want to accept it. So this is the proportion that they accept that more difficult work offer over the rest offer. But you can also see that the effects are really magnified at the highest effort level. So people are much less likely to want to help when it's another person and it's a high effort compared to when it's another person and it's a lower effort, showing that effort is really modulating our decisions to help. So because we have this task that has lots of different reward and lots of different effort levels, we can also apply some of these computational models of effort discounting to try and just get a single parameter that can capture people's motivation to help themselves and other people. So the key parameter here is shown in this light teal. It's this K parameter. And what K does is it indexes how motivated you are. So if you have a very low K parameter, that means that you're kind of always going to accept the work offer regardless of the effort level increasing. You're kind of not really affected by the effort level. But if you have a very high K parameter, so this lighter blue here, this means that as the effort level goes up, you're much less likely to choose to want to do it. And we could compare different shapes of how people did this. So whether it was a linear effect, so, every effort level has the same added increment, or whether it's a parabolic effect. And we found that it was parabolic, meaning that higher effort costs are having an even stronger influence on people's decisions. And what we wanted to now check was in different models whether this K parameter needed to be different for self and other trials, and whether it was then the parameter itself was different between those trials. And that's exactly what we found. So we found that a model that had separate K parameters for self and other best explained the data. And on top of that, we found that people in general had a higher K parameter for someone else compared to themselves. So that means that their line looked more like this when they were making decisions for someone else, and more like one of these flatter lines when making decisions for themselves. So because we have this K parameter, it's a really nice measure that we can then also compare across things like the lifespan. And as I said, particularly when financial costs might be difficult to measure because older people might have just generated more wealth. So in a different study, we also tested this comparing young and older adults. And what we found was that older adults were much more pro-socially motivated than younger adults. So you can see that they've got a much lower K parameter than the young adults here. And we found that there was maybe a slight increase for self, but it wasn't as strong. So this is captured in this recipient by group interaction, where the older adults are just relatively more pro-socially motivated. So they're much more likely to pick the work offer when it benefits someone else. We also showed in the modelling that this wasn't because older adults no longer distinguished between self and other. We still found the best fitting model in both groups was one that had these separate Ks, but we can now see that there's this higher motivation in the older adults with this lower K parameter. So going back to the imaging data that we did in the young adults, what we wanted to do was to use representational similarity analysis to look at some of the neural representations of effort. And we thought that this was an interesting approach because we had this very condition-rich design, which is needed for things like RSA. And what it would allow us to do was to look for this kind of multivariate representation of how people coded the effort level for others. So what I'm showing here is an effort RDM, or representational dissimilarity matrix. And what it does is it doesn't just code what the effort level is, but codes how different it is from all of the other effort levels. So if you imagine the effort levels go from like 2 here to 6 here, you can see that the most different part of the RDM here would be this yellow bit, the most dissimilar, and this would be the difference between effort level 2, the easy effort, and effort level 6, the hard effort. So we can take this correlation matrix based on these cues that people view, and then we can correlate it with different regions of interest in the brain to ask, does this brain area code a representation of effort for self and other? And what we found was this part of the brain in the anterior cingulate gyrus, which I mentioned before, which is much more ventral than this more dorsal ACC area, often spoken about in decision making, showed this really interesting pattern. So what it did was it had this multivariate representation of effort for others. So on all the trials where you saw how much effort you would have to put in for someone else, but it didn't represent the effort costs for self. So when you saw the same cue, but it was about your own effort, it didn't respond. And it also responded more to the prosocial effort than the self effort, which we thought was very interesting. And what's really cool about this part of the brain is that if we look at non-human primate studies, then we can also see that lesions to the anterior cingulate gyrus seem to specifically disrupt social behavior in macaque monkeys. And this part of the brain also contains single neurons that signal when another monkey gets a reward, but the same neuron doesn't signal when the monkey themselves gets a reward or when neither monkey gets a reward. So there seems to be something quite socially specific at the implementational level about this part of the brain in the anterior cingulate gyrus. And we also saw, if we look back at the force period, so when people actually had to energize their action, if we just do a parametric regression of how much effort you have to put in to help someone else, so this is at a different point in the trial, again, we see the anterior cingulate gyrus, and again, it responds only to other and not to self, and more to other than self. So this is quite consistent evidence that there's something about prosocial effort coding in the anterior cingulate gyrus. So of course we know that fMRI is great and representational similarity analysis is cool because we can look at these multivariate representations, but we know that fMRI isn't necessarily causal. So next we wanted to ask what happens if we actually have damage to these parts of the brain? Does that change how willing we are to help another person? And this is work that I did in collaboration with a Wellcome Fellow in my lab, Dr. Joe Cutler. So what me and Joe did was we looked at data from a relatively large sample of patients with very focal lesions to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So this group had these lesions as a result of a subarachnoid hemorrhage. So that meant that they really just had lesions here rather than lesions elsewhere that you might see with something like traumatic brain injury. And we spent 4 years collecting this data. We tried to get as many patients as possible. So we ended up with 25, which is a lot higher than is often done in this field, where sample sizes are perhaps lower than 10. And this was also very useful because then we could use our lesion symptom mapping approach as well. So we had 25 patients who had this medial prefrontal damage, we had 17 lesion controls, and we also had 40 healthy age and gender matched controls. And that was really important too, showing that previous results of how older adults might also be different in this task. So it was important that our control group was age and gender matched. So we did the same social allocation procedure at the beginning where they met another person. We then gave them exactly the same prosocial effort task. But now we could ask, does damage to the VMPFC affect the willingness to put in effort to help others? And secondly, can we use that lesion symptom mapping to look at the specific parts of VMPFC that might be involved? So looking at the behavioral results, so again, we can look at this K parameter because it's a really nice summary measure of all the effort and reward levels. And what we saw was that the VMPFC patients had a much higher discounting rate, which is plotted the other way around here just to be confusing. So they're discounting more, specifically for the other person compared to self. So all groups show the self-other difference, but you can see it's greatly magnified in the VMPFC lesion group. So then what we can do is we can take this K parameter and map it onto the whole medial prefrontal cortex to see if there's a subregion that is important where damage there affects your prosocial effort. And what we saw was that the part of the brain that did that was this subgenual anterior cingulate cortex, this area 25, where patients who had damage here specifically showed much greater discounting for the other person, and they also showed less willing to pick that work option just in the choice behavior. So it seems that rather than the anterior cingulate gyrus, it's damage to the subgenual ACC region that reduces the prosocial effort. So to summarize that first part, what I showed was that young adults seem to be less willing to put in effort to help another person than themselves, particularly when the effort costs are high, and older adults might have relatively higher prosocial motivation. I showed that the anterior cingulate gyrus carries a specific representation of prosocial effort, and secondly, that the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex, instead, if you have damage there, that causally contributes to this prosocial and not the self-benefiting effort. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was when we get to the consequences of our actions. So when there's an outcome that has actually either helped or harmed the other person. So if we think about how we might learn to benefit another person, again, we can look to these kind of non-social algorithms. So in particular, as you may have heard, reinforcement learning or associative learning. So the idea here is that the value of choosing an option is updated by how unexpected the outcome is. So if I pick an option and I get a reward, then I get this positive prediction error because I wasn't expecting that the action would lead to a reward. And that's the prediction error. So it's the difference between the reward I get and how much I valued that action in the first place. And just like in the effort models, we can have a subject-specific parameter. So rather than the K parameter, now we've got a learning rate, which is updating value over time. So it's doing it for every single trial in a cumulative way. And this learning rate scales the prediction error. So we can see how the learning rate differs between different people and between different learning contexts. And what I like about this framework is it's not just theoretical. We know that there's specific neural correlates in the brain that actually signal these prediction errors. So in the seminal work by Wolfram Schultz and colleagues, what they showed was that dopamine neurons in the ventral tegmental area increase their firing rate when rewards aren't predicted but unexpectedly occur. And they also decrease their firing rate when you really think you're going to get a reward, but actually you don't. So that's just like a negative prediction error. And since that seminal work, we know that other regions that receive projections from these dopamine neurons in the ventral tegmental area, such as the subgenual ACC and the anterior cingulate gyrus, also carry a prediction error-like signal. So we wanted to ask, can we use this framework to understand how we actually learn to benefit others? So in the first study now done a few years ago, what we did was we tested 31 young adults, we tested them during fMRI, and we used the social allocation procedure. And in this task, what we did was we gave people a trial and error learning task where they saw two different pictures that were probabilistically associated with reward. So one picture always had a high probability of reward and one had a low probability. And participants would just learn over time which one was better as they would see feedback showing them whether they got points or didn't get points. But crucially, we manipulated the task and who got the points. So in the self trials, they were told you'll see the points, they'll be converted into money for you. In the prosocial trials, the other person that you met will receive points and they'll be converted into money for them. And we also had this interesting control condition because you can get people to kind of learn about nothing, but it's very hard to make them put in effort for nothing. And here, what we did was we told people, you'll see symbols, you'll make choices and get feedback, but these points won't be converted into any money, either for you or for the other person. So by using this paradigm, we could look at the learning rates and say, are people learning at different rates when they're learning to reward themselves, someone else, or no one? And secondly, can we again identify these specific, perhaps more socially specialized brain areas that are involved in these three different conditions? So what we saw first of all was that, as expected, people had a much higher learning rate about their own reward outcomes than outcomes that helped another person or no one. And intriguingly, when we looked at the brain, the only part of the brain that we saw that showed a socially specific prediction error signal was again this subgenual anterior cingulate cortex region, so shown here in green. And when we plot what happened there, and because it's a parametric design, we can kind of look at the difference from zero. We saw that it positively signals as prosocial prediction error. So every time I see the outcome for the other person, how surprising that is. But it doesn't signal a self-prediction error, and it also doesn't signal a no-one prediction error. And that's really cool because we can imagine that sometimes parts of the brain are just caring about things being not me. And the no one condition kind of controls for that because it's a kind of not me condition, but you're still seeing the outcomes. So in newer work, we wanted to follow up on these imaging findings and ask, well, what happens if people actually have brain damage in the subgenual ACC region? And this was work led by a PhD student in my group, Margot. So we tested 28 patients who had these focal VMPFC lesions again, 21 lesion controls, and a very large sample of healthy age and gender matched controls. They did exactly the same task again, but now we could ask whether it's actually the damage in the brain that can causally impact how we learn in the different conditions. And can we use that lesion symptom mapping again to kind of find these little subregions that might be involved in different aspects of the task? So what I'm going to plot here is first of all just the difference in accuracy because that's a nice like clear measure. The modeling is quite complicated, so we'll just focus on accuracy first. And what we found was that people who as a group who had damage to the VMPFC were overall they were just less accurate at learning for another person compared to both the healthy controls and compared to the lesion controls. So this is the difference in accuracy between other and no one. And just like in the first data I showed, people don't often distinguish between other and no one, at least in this sample. And that was the same case for the lesion controls. But VMPOC patients actually do worse when the other person receives the outcome compared to when even no one receives the outcome. So it's like they really don't care about the other person. Unsurprisingly, we also found some kind of self-representations in VMPFC because we know that VMPFC should be really important just for reinforcement learning. And how that manifested was we saw that whereas healthy controls, are quite good at being more correct for self than no one, and that was the same in the lesion controls, the VMPFC patients no longer show that self advantage. So you'd expect them to show the self-benefiting advantage, and that completely goes away as well. So it's these independent effects on prosocial behavior and self-learning. So then Margot, as I said, did lots of complicated modeling. We found a much more complex model one, which had these separate prediction errors that were positive and negative. So you end up with a lot of learning rates. But what was cool was then we could map those onto the brain. So the first thing we found was that damage very specifically in this overlapping region of the subgenual ACC that we found in the fMRI studies, if people had damage here, it showed that exact effect. So they were much worse at having prediction errors for other people compared to no one. Whereas we see the normal pattern both in healthy controls and lesion controls. So if you have damage here, then you have this kind of specific impairment in learning about positive prediction errors for another person compared to when no one gets the outcome. And intriguingly, we also did actually see something in the anterior cingulate gyrus in this study. So here we saw that actually when it came to the signaling of negative prediction errors, so outcomes that are worse than expected, if you had damage to the anterior cingulate gyrus, then you had this kind of weird enhanced signaling of bad outcomes for someone else. So to summarize that, we found that people are slower at learning to reward others compared to themselves, and that is in young adults. We saw that it seems to be the subgenual ACC region that's really important for this prosocial learning in fMRI. And then we did a new study showing that also if you have damage to the subgenual ACC region, then you're worse at prosocial learning. And perhaps also when it comes to prosocial learning, we see this anterior cingulate gyrus part of the brain where you have this kind of increased signaling of negative prediction errors when someone else gets the outcome. Okay, so in the final part, I wanted to shift focus a bit and just briefly talk about social influence, because I think that that's a really other important aspect of social behavior that might be crucial for solving some of these global challenges. And I wanted to start with an experiment that you're probably all quite familiar with, just because it's quite fun, and that's the marshmallow experiment. So I thought I'd just show a little demonstration of what happens in that experiment if YouTube wants to work. Okay. Can you see my screen? If someone nods, yeah, cool. All right, I'll just play a little bit of it.
Okay, sit in that chair. All right, here's the deal. Marshmallow for you. You can either wait, and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another one, so then you'll have two. But stay in here and stay in the chair till I come back, okay? All right. I'm gonna go do. All right, so I'm gonna leave and then I'll come back, okay? So you can either eat it right now or you can wait. Either way, okay? Okay. How'd you do? Did you do good? You did?
Yeah.
You wanted to eat it, didn't you? Yeah. So did I tell you to give you another one? Okay, now you can have both. You need them.
So we'll stop at him showing the rewards of waiting, perhaps. So I think what's really nice about this task is it perhaps shows that how long we wait for rewards is a really important aspect that we kind of need to learn about in our life, that there's lots of individual differences. And then we might wonder kind of where these preferences come from. And I think one way in which we might shape these preferences over time is, of course, from other people. So from observing people around us, we really might change or even develop these preferences for waiting for others or waiting for rewards in the future. And lots of studies have started to examine how people are influenced by others and whether their choices change our own preferences for different outcomes. So we were very interested in the parts of the brain that might be involved in this process, and this was work led by another PhD student in my lab, Jalin Su. So what he was interested in was looking at these patients. So now we had 33 medial prefrontal patients, healthy controls and lesion controls, and dissociating whether parts of the medial prefrontal cortex were perhaps more involved in social influence, so things like the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, or how much other people change our willingness to wait for marshmallows. but separating that from different parts of the brain that might more generally be involved in delay discounting. So simply the willingness to wait for another marshmallow. So we hypothesized that that might be more related to ventral parts of the medial prefrontal cortex in the VMPFC. So what we did was we gave participants a temporal discounting task that also had this element of social influence. So first of all, everyone started with a self block. So what we did was we gave them offers that varied in the willingness to wait. So people could have £6 today or £18 in 6 weeks. They would then make their choice for self, and then they would see the outcome. But then after people had done this self-block, what we did was we got them to make choices on behalf of 2 other people. And based on their own discounting preferences in the self-blocks, we modeled these people to either be more patient in their decisions or more impulsive in their decisions. So in the other block, they're now choosing for someone else, in this case, Martin. They choose that Martin wants to pick the patient option, waiting in the future. And then they receive feedback and they're told, in this case, wrong, your decision for Martin was incorrect. So we gave them lots of trials where they learn about these preferences of someone else. And then after that, they then do the self blocks again. So say this is a patient person, they then do self again. And say this is then the impulsive person, they then do self again. And these different self blocks, so self blocks 2 and 3, allowed us to measure the influence of other people on their choices. So first, if we just look at the kind of block 1, so that's just their own discounting preferences, what we saw was that damage to the medial prefrontal cortex, but also damage elsewhere, made people more impulsive. So what we found, so this is done in the negative, lower scores are more patient, was that compared to healthy controls, just generally having brain damage made people more impulsive. We could also use our model to measure how uncertain they were in their decisions. And when we looked at that, what we saw was that, intriguingly, actually, the healthy controls and medial prefrontal patients were quite similar in their preference uncertainty, but they were different from the lesion controls. So this then provided a nice contrast between having the medial prefrontal lesions versus having lesions elsewhere. So this would suggest that in general, if you have a medial prefrontal lesion, it might make you more temporally impulsive, but it's not going to change your preference uncertainty. So then we could use these kind of baselines to then investigate whether social influence was then related to MPFC damage. So to do that, we made this Bayesian model that used KL divergence to look at how people were shifting their preferences. So how this worked was we estimated a distribution of their discount rates from the first block for self. So this is their kind of baseline discounting. We then showed them the choices of another person. So this is where they're learning about the preferences for someone else. And then what we can do is we can measure the shift in their distributions afterwards. So now you can see they've learned about the impulsive other, and their own baseline has now shifted forwards to be much more like the impulsive other person. And this would be our measure of KL divergence. So taking that across the different groups, what we saw was that, very interestingly, medial prefrontal patients were more influenced by the impulsive other person that they learnt about compared to the patient other person. And this pattern was completely the opposite in the healthy control. So we saw an interaction where this increased impulsivity susceptibility to impulsivity happened after medial prefrontal damage. We also saw that in general, MPFC patients were just more susceptible to social influence. So these 2 bars here are overall higher than the bars in the lesion controls. So it seems that having damage as an entire group to the MPFC area makes you perhaps more impulsive, but similar in your uncertainty preferences, and then you also have this shift in social influence. So next we could take these and map them onto the brain with the lesion symptom mapping. And just as hypothesized, we found that patients who had damage to this more dorsal medial prefrontal lesion region seem to be much more susceptible to the impulsive social influence. So what I'm showing on the right here is just a bar showing if people from this specific region, if they don't have a lesion, and if they do have a lesion, how that affects their KL divergence. But we also found areas that just generally related to the non-social influence, so just that self-baseline block. So they were quite different regions. So there we found it was the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum. So patients as a group who had damage here, specifically in these two regions, were much more impulsive at baseline. So this suggests a real difference between the more dorsal parts of the medial prefrontal cortex and the more ventral ones. So to summarize that, what we found was that medial prefrontal damage seems to lead to increased impulsivity and greater susceptibility to social influence. It was specifically the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex that increased the social influence, whereas it was the more ventromedial prefrontal cortex that increased delay discounting and thus impulsivity. So to summarize all of that together, and putting it back in that Morian framework, what I showed was that effort, learning, and others' preferences strongly influence our decisions to help others, as well as our own choices, in a manner that is distinct from helping ourselves, or perhaps our own discounting preferences. So we might be able to get these kind of specific social and non-social bits. I suggested that we can use some of these same algorithms, but they're weighted differently. So we might find different learning rates and different K parameters, but the algorithm structure itself is essentially the same. And finally, I showed these multiple different parts of the brain that seem to show this perhaps slight social specialization. So I spoke about ACCG and subgenual ACC that are necessary for prosocial effort and learning, whereas dorsomedial prefrontal cortex seems to be necessary for constraining social influence. I didn't have time to talk about the other areas today, but what I would say is that these were the kind of only ones that come out as socially specific. Of course, in all studies, we find other areas, but they always did both self and other, so they didn't show this specific pattern. And our next steps is we want to take this multi-level approach. We want to now look at an earlier part of the lifespan. So we're looking at adolescence to adulthood, and we're also testing children who have extreme antisocial behavior. So they have conduct disorder, and we're trying to develop more ecological tasks to do that. So I'd like to thank all of the funders of the research, you for your attention, and I'm really excited to have a discussion with you about the work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so I will open the floor for questions. So if you want to just raise your virtual hand, and I can kind of ask people to unmute as they come in. I can go ahead and get us started. So damage in the VMPFC and and the dorsal media prefrontal cortex. What other symptoms are associated with that we know of? More generally?
So I guess it's kind of with dorsomedial prefrontal lesions, because the sample sizes have been quite small in previous lesion studies, and often they might only kind of go to the more ventral parts. I think our knowledge of that region is mainly from imaging. There has been a bit of work using brain stimulation, which some people have argued might also target that region. So there was some studies suggesting that if you stimulate there with something like TMS, then you can increase the self-other emergence. So you kind of get this more like blurring between self and other. I think with VMPFC damage, there's a really long history of how that part of the brain is involved in various different social and non-social processes. And I think it's only now with like the larger sample sizes that what's very important is thinking about those like sub-regions, because we know that they have different connectivities, different parts of the brain, like different cytoarchitecture. So I think rather than thinking about them as a whole region, it's maybe different parts doing different things and in different contexts.
Julia?
Hi, thanks. Thanks very much for the talk. I really enjoyed it, and am still kind of digesting a lot of the computational modeling and neuroimaging findings and patient findings. But I had a question about the prosocial learning paradigm, so that the middle part of the talk where you had this control condition of the no one condition. And I'm sure you've been asked this before, but is that really a neutral control condition, or is there maybe the possibility that in that condition, other motives actually come to the fore that maybe are less salient when there is a monetary reward?
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, I think the problem with social and non-social stuff is it's so hard to make match designs, if you really want to isolate something social and not. The kind of inspiration for it was from some of the animal work done by Steve Chang. So they always have this really cool condition where you just see rewards going into a bucket. So, sometimes reward goes to one monkey, sometimes the monkey sees the reward go to another monkey, but they always have the control where it's like reward into a bucket. Um, so we tried to make that the kind of reason for having the no one condition to get this kind of not self signal, which I think the brain also really cares about that might not be social at all. I think that what I didn't show you, and one interesting thing is if we just look at prediction errors in ventral striatum, we can see ventral striatum signals prediction errors in all three conditions. So self, other, no one, and bilaterally. So I think it is, I think maybe the points are potentially rewarding for people, or at least it showed that there's some parts of the brain where that condition just acted like the other ones, which is reassuring. But I do think generally, yeah, it's just challenging. That's why in the effort work we don't have a third condition because you can't get people to squeeze for like outcomes for no one. So I'm very open to thinking about other ways to have that control. But from some of the neural findings and some of the behavior, I think it still does a decent job. Thank you.
Michael?
Hey, so I'm just curious about the role of DMPFC in the last result that you talked about. So my understanding, and I feel like it's still somewhat limited, is that DMPFC is often seen as like a mentalizing region involved in a lot of social processes, but also it can be involved in like negative social processes, like specifically people you don't like. And so I was just thinking of so you didn't talk about it in this way, so I was just curious, like, I think like resisting social influence, it would kind of be consistent with that latter interpretation of like people you don't like. But I'm just curious kind of how you fit that into like all the different things that DMPFC does in the social domain.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So I'm not familiar with the it signaling people you don't like. So I definitely have to look up that literature because that, as you said, like what's kind of interesting about the DMPFC findings is it's not that damage makes you less susceptible, it's actually making them more susceptible to social influence, suggesting that it is like some weird kind of control thing, or like, you kind of need it to constrain social influence, whereas it could have been that damage there just makes you less influence. So I think that literature would be really cool to integrate, but I wasn't familiar with it. In terms of
Yeah,
mental,
no, the one that
sorry, you go.
sorry, just to say that, yeah, the
Yeah.
one thing the one paper that comes to mind, I know there's a paper about like political in groups and out groups, and so
Mhm.
they showed like basically considering with American politics basically, and like considering in group candidates, you get VMPFC activity, and considering outgroup candidates, you get DMPFC activity. Although I also have some data that's not published yet that with like political accusations where we get more activation in DMPFC for candidates that you don't like. So at least in the political domain, but I think it might go beyond that. But anyways, yeah. That's where I kind of direct you to look. Yeah, I'm curious. Sorry, I know I interrupted you, but yeah, I'm curious to hear yeah what else you had to say about the mentalizing piece too.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. I'll have to look that up and maybe send me your paper when it's ready for other people to look at it. Because yeah, I hadn't thought about that literature, and I do think the positive negative thing is very interesting. Yeah, whether it's more in group out group. So with mentalizing, yeah, I mean DMPFC is the bit that's meant to do mentalizing. Like loads of studies said that we do actually have data on a strategic mentalizing game in these patients. And having medial prefrontal damage doesn't do anything to it. So surprisingly, it's doing like different parts are all involved in these prosocial tasks and social influence, but there is no role in mentalizing. And we're just writing that up at the moment. So it's this original study by Alan Hampton and colleagues in like 2008. So it's this work shirk experiment where you're strategically interacting with someone else and you use like influence play in order to try and influence what the other person is doing. You can measure the different levels of mentalizing. Yeah, and we find that the patients are completely fine. The same model wins. They use influence play. They earn the same amount of money in the task as healthy controls and as lesion controls. So we were very surprised, but it actually seems like the one thing DMPFC and MPFC are doing is not mentalizing, but all of the other stuff. Yeah, and even because we thought that that was very surprising. We also have self-report from the patients being like, "Did you try and influence the other person in the task?" And they also self-report that they are using mentalizing strategies. So yeah, I
Yeah.
wonder.
I was saying, no, it's just like, yeah, I mean, that's really like my confusion in this literature because I feel like TPJ and like posterior STS do a lot with mentalizing, and so like where it's DMPFC and where it's TPJ. But so that's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that they were specifically tasks that like failed to find DMPFC with mentalizing. That's interesting. So yeah, it seems like it's like a subtlety that I felt like I didn't know the answer. Maybe it hasn't been fully drawn out in the literature, but then it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely thought it'd be involved. And I think you make exactly the point that we were thinking, like, we're not saying there is no brain area for mentalizing, but maybe it is more posterior. Maybe, TPJ and STS might be a bit more causally involved. And of course, people are then using MPFC, but it might just not be critical for it. We do lesion mapping and stuff, and we find that one thing that MPFC patients show is that they're slower to mentalize. So they're slower to mentalize, but they do get the right answer. And then if you model a DDM that captures why they're slower to mentalize, then those parameters map onto medial prefrontal cortex. So it basically seems like if you have a mentalizing task that's really reaction time dependent, then it might make people look like, MPFC, DMPFC is important, but actually they can get to the right answer. They just might be a bit slower after MPFC damage.
Cool.
Tyler?
Yeah. But thank you for your question. And do send me your paper.
I was wondering for the effort task, is there an effect on like duration within the task? So do they tend to not use as much effort at the end? And if so, if it's sort of like linear, or do they sort of reach a saturation point where they no longer want to do any effort?
Yeah, it's a really good question, like thinking about how, fatigue plays a part in these decisions and whether kind of choices change over time. So what we tried to do is rather than measuring that because the task wasn't like very well developed to look at kind of overtime fatigue effects, what we did was we made sure that, the highest effort level is like 70% of their maximum, and they're only encountering high effort offers like maybe 3 times in a block. So, and because you've got the self condition and the other condition and they're interleaved, people aren't actually putting in that much effort during the task. So we try to like minimize fatigue that way. Also, if they rest for like the same amount of time as if they choose the work offer. So we made sure that was fixed. So there wasn't any kind of temporal discounting in that task. I think we did look into kind of trial number as an effect to see if that was different. And my memory was that it just affected both conditions. So in general, people were just much less willing to pick the higher effort options towards the end of the experiment. But I do think something like prosocial fatigue is like super interesting, and it probably really does happen. Like we've all experienced that, we quite quickly get like if we do one act of kindness, we're done for the day. So I think that would be a really cool thing to like design a task that we could look at that more closely. And there are people who've developed like computational models of fatigue. So I think that would be a great thing to properly look at next.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah, Sebastian.
Thanks very much. Really interesting. You highlighted the important role of prediction error in reward learning. And if I understood you correctly, when it comes to punishment or maybe losses, it's just basically a reverse or a negative prediction error. I just wondered, is this basically generally true? Would you say that losses are basically falling below the expectation, or do you also sometimes find that other brain regions are involved depending on the valence of outcomes? Just curious what
Yeah.
you think about it.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think in the initial work we didn't separate positive and negative prediction errors. We just looked at general ones. So it was only when we got to the lesion study that we started to kind of look into valence a bit more. I think also because in the task, this one you either get 100 points or you get 0 points. So it's not a like strong loss condition. It's just a like absence of reward that signals the negative prediction error. So we do have a new task where we have rewards, punishments, and then like two neutral conditions, which I think is quite important to look at the neural correlates because we know that reward and punishment aren't on the same linear scale, which I guess gets to your question. So when we have tried to like separate reward and punishment, we've kind of had reward versus neutral and punishment versus neutral, which we couldn't really do in this task. Um, but yeah, I think the way that the model worked is it just cared about whether the outcome was 0 or whether it was points, and then it would signal a negative or positive prediction error. And I think, yeah, I'd probably use the other task if we wanted to look at that in more detail. But we need to analyze the data. And I do, yeah, I do think that valence will have quite a big effect. Some of our initial stuff has shown that perhaps people care more about other people's punishment than their reward because of this kind of moral thing that you have where there's this omission bias and stuff. You know, you don't want to pick an action that harms someone else, but you're quite happy to pick an action that results in less reward for someone else because that's almost like something you don't care about. So I do think valence is going to have a big influence on like social decisions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other last questions? All right, then I think we will probably go ahead and end here. I put a link in the chat if you want to nominate a new speaker. Our next speaker, someone knows it off the top of their head, they can correct me. While I look for it. There we go.
Just put it in the chat.
Yes, April 30th. Great. And we'll have Dr. Gruber come to talk to us about how curiosity shapes spatial exploration and cognitive map formation. So look out for that, as well as if you have any nominations or anything like that. But thank you again, Dr. Lockwood. This was really, really great.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation and for coming to my talk. And good luck with the rest of the series. Hope to see you soon at a conference or something. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.